Chapter 4, Part 5, we're going to move up from the First Amendment to the Fourth Amendment. Let me mention quickly the Second Amendment because I know a lot of people have a lot of interest in that. The Second Amendment, of course, has to do with the right to bear arms. Let me quickly mention that up until a few years ago when the Supreme Court addressed this, there had been virtually no Supreme Court law on the issue. And there was a big controversy among legal experts and scholars as to whether or not the Second Amendment meant that individuals had a right to a gun or whether it only applied to militias. Of course, the Supreme Court a few years ago ruled that no, the Second Amendment in fact is a right of an individual to bear arms. However, it was pretty clear from the majority decision and the dissenting opinions that this, as most rights under the Constitution, is not absolute, and that the court in future cases would have to determine what restrictions are constitutional with regard to bear arms. So you can expect in the future issues with regard to things like weapons that have like automatic rifles, bazookas, nuclear weapons, the whole range of weapons, what is covered by those, as well as perhaps some laws that regulate carrying a gun on you and not visible. So those are some of the laws that may come forth. All right, so the Fourth Amendment we'll talk about briefly because we talk about the Fourth Amendment a lot when we talk about criminal law because it's primarily geared towards criminal activity. So the criminal law requires law enforcement officers to have a search warrant before searching or seizing private property. And in order to get a search warrant, you have to have probable cause. Probable cause, we'll talk about the definition of that when we talk about criminal law. It's a sort of amorphous kind of definition, but it basically means that it's more or less likely that a crime has been committed, and that's there's probable cause to believe the facts and that the person being investigated or charged committed that crime. Search warrants have to be specific. General searches through personal belongings are illegal. Generally, business inspectors must have a warrant, though there's some exceptions to that. For example, with spoiled or contaminated food. We'll talk about the regulatory area, things like OSHA, the Food and Drug Administration, and their authority to search based upon the needs of the public welfare when we talk about administrative agencies. Okay, that brings us up to the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees that no person can be compelled to testify against himself in a criminal proceeding. This does not extend to fictitious individuals or corporations or partnerships. Okay. Due process is interesting. Due process has two parts to it. There is what we call procedural due process, and then there's what we call substantive due process. So procedural due process basically says that the government cannot take your life, liberty, or property without providing you with process. And what process means is generally the right to notice about why the activity is taking place and an opportunity to be heard by a neutral party that has the authority to overturn that activity. So usually it's either an administrative type of hearing or a court hearing that you're entitled to. So that's due process. Okay. We'll talk about equal protection in the next video. Substantive due process, though, has to do with substantive rights, and that is that the government cannot interfere with certain, what the Supreme Court has defined as fundamental rights. the right to travel, the right to procreate. So in those instances, if the government passes a law that infringes upon your right to travel or your right to procreate, they have to show a very substantial, compelling interest in that law, and it's almost impossible for such laws to pass scrutiny. So that's what we mean by substantive due process. Now remember, the Fifth Amendment due process only applies against the federal government. However, the same rules apply against the states through the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment includes a due process clause. So the important thing about due process is to remember that it entails both a procedural aspect and a substantive aspect. The Fifth Amendment applies against the federal government, the 14th Amendment against the states, so that they cannot deprive you of due process. So we'll stop there and pick up with video 6.